All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for checking out this week's Sports and Leisure History Look Back. As always, I'm Jeff Klein, and I'm here with my good friend, my partner, and the big sports brain, Clayton Hamilton. How you doing, Clayton?
I'm doing great. I do not have enough squares, though, on my quad box TV for all of the games that are going on this particular week.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, and a lot, not just games, but just a lot of stuff going on. And I'm not talking about the drama of who's dating who, or what we're seeing with the Patriots coach, where there's all the Real Housewives of the New England Patriots or whatever that is going on. But are the Mets still really bad? Is there any sign of hope for the Mets?
Well, I thought you were going to talk about Klay Thompson and Megan the Stallion and all of that, which is great because I don't care. So I'm glad you
Right.
didn't. But the Mets dropped a doubleheader today to the Colorado Rockies. And the question that it begs is that April is often overreaction month, but is there underreaction in Mets camp and Phillies camp?
Yeah, because it's a shocker that the Mets have the worst record in baseball, and tied with them is the Phillies, and both teams haven't even hit the double-digit win mark yet. So that division is being led by the Braves, which okay, can go with that, and the Marlins of all teams.
Yeah, the Marlins have gotten good pitching and some
Oh
timely
yeah,
hitting. And same with the Nationals. Even if the Nationals don't win, they're a tough out.
yeah,
You don't want to see the Nationals if you've got to win 2 out of 3.
yeah. Uh, and then speaking of sort of dumpster fires in baseball, what's going on in Boston? They fired like everyone. I think the clubhouse attendant might have got caught up in that firing. But seriously though, they fired what six coaches, including Alex Cora. They brought up Chad Tracy. Sorry, I was about to say Jim Tracy. It's his son, Chad Tracy, as the new manager. It's a kind of chaos over there on the East Coast.
Yeah, they had a massive blowout of the Orioles on Saturday, and they celebrated by firing everyone. And then they won today. So
So is Steve
it's working.
Cohen? Is Steve Cohen going to get jealous and decide, wait, if the Red Sox can fire everyone, I can fire everyone on the Mets?
He's got to keep pace for Executive
Right.
of the Year. So watch
Exactly.
out. Watch out if you're in Mets land or in Philly. But I'm surprised that Philadelphia is as calm as they are about as
Yeah.
bad as they've been.
Well, I think the GM in Philly, Dombrowski, he's not a huge panic guy. So I think they've kind of been through that before, and they sort of pull out of it. So I think you feel pretty good if you're being out boat raced by the Marlins and the Nationals, because you probably feel like you're going to even out with them and get up there. Um, and you mentioned all the quad boxes, all the games going on, a lot of NBA playoff, lot of lopsided series going on. There's a few that are competitive. Have you been catching up on a lot of the NBA?
I have. I was really disappointed in 2 games, and that being Denver dropping 3-1 behind Minnesota, and they really gave away game 2. And I really wanted this series to be one of those go down to game 7 because these 2 teams are pretty evenly matched. And now Anthony Edwards, he's going to be out for multiple weeks. And Dante DiVincenzo's done for the rest of the playoffs. So there's a slight opening for Denver to come back and make this a 7-game series, but it would be much better at 2-2 than at 3-1. And then the Lakers lost today to make that series 3-1 after the Rockets just absolutely gave away game 3, which was sad because I thought this was going to be a really tight 7-game series, and it really could have been and should have been if it were 2-2. But man, crawling out of that 3-0 hole is just so hard. So maybe we'll get a better rounds in week 2, week 3.
Yeah, the Rockets are hanging on for dear life. Definitely thought that would be a much more competitive series. I'm with you. And I just wanted to mention the Spurs. You kind of wondered coming into the playoffs. A lot of talk about Wemby and Spurs and so forth. Nice to see them. They went up 3-1 on the Blazers. I'm pretty excited about that just because I like the Spurs. I like this version of the Spurs.
I really like this version of the Spurs, but I was glad to see that Portland has been competitive. They were able to get a game. They were in today's game really until about the middle of the third quarter. So I like it when things are good in Portland. They're always an easy franchise to root for. And then over on the NHL side, you're getting a wham banger of a series between Montreal and Tampa. That is absolutely legit. And a huge win today for the Anaheim Ducks to go up 3-1 on Edmonton in a series that nobody thought that Anaheim was going to have a chance in. And Edmonton has proven a very difficult out. And the Oilers are Oilering again, and they're continuing to be a disappointment. They're kind of like the Angels of hockey because they've got Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, and they can't win. They can't win a championship.
Well, to be fair, the Angels couldn't even get to the playoffs, so maybe that's not the best comparison. But yeah, they got big names, but just can't seem to ever get it done.
No, Montreal right now is flying the flag for Canada. They're at least at 2-2. The Senators are already gone. The Oilers are 3-1. So hey, last team left in Canada. Turn the lights out when you're done.
Yeah, I know that's big talk in Canada because hockey was such for many years, as we talk about on our podcast a lot. They were the center of the universe for hockey, and now it's been a long time since Canada teams have been dominant in NHL.
That is correct. But Montreal, I tell you what, Montreal is playing one heck of a series, and they are feisty. And this reminds me of the gutty Montreal teams from the 70s. They're not as talented, but they're gritty and gutty. Yeah. And if anybody's going to do it, I think it's going to be Montreal. I don't think it's going to be Edmonton, but you never know. You got two of the best players in the world. They could always find some magic with the Oilers.
Well, more basketball to come, more hockey to come. The playoffs last a pretty long time. I'm sure we'll have some history about playoffs in both those sports in our upcoming podcasts. But this week I wanted to get into there's a bit of a theme. We have talk about some really players who had some really great days. But before we get into that, I just wanted to remind everyone that follow us on Facebook and on Substack if you like these history posts. We post a lot more information about the history of the day. You could find us at Sports and Leisure. Follow along, share the information, share the knowledge. But let's go ahead and get into this week's show. And we're going to kick it off with Rickey Henderson because the game don't start until Rickey comes to the plate. And on April 24th in 1987, Rickey had a pretty good day. He had a home run. He did 2 home runs in the game, and it was the first time in MLB history that a player had a home run off of 2 different 300-game winners, and those 300-game winners were Steve Carlton and Phil Niekro. So pretty good day for Rickey Henderson, who in his own right is a great player. So, but I know you're a big Yankee fan. He was with the Yankees during that time. Any memories of that, kind of when you were watching baseball?
You know what was funny about that is I had sort of blocked out in my head that Steve Carlton was on the Cleveland Indians. And he was only there for half a season, and it was, at a time in my life that I was really kind of busy during that summer. So I'm not too mad at myself for forgetting that. But this will never happen again, Jeff. Yeah. This will never happen again. And the reason that it will never happen again is there will never be another time, I think, in baseball history that 2 300-game winners are on the same team, let alone there might not even be 2 300-game winners ever in baseball again unless they radically start to change either how they calculate wins or they fix the epidemic that is starting pitching.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree with you. Will we see a 300-game winner? I don't know, but someone would have to become a reliever, right? Unless it was just something really bizarre going on, or someone at the end of their career. But you're right. those 300 game winners are pretty few and far between, and I think we're looking at like 225 game winners as like really remarkable these days.
Do you know who the two closest 300 game winners are who are active right now?
I want to say Scherzer's got to be one of them.
Scherzer is at 222 wins.
Yeah.
And Justin Verlander, who's at 266, right. And he's on the injured list. But those are the two closest guys. They've still got 40 and 78, 36. They're not going to last that long.
Hey, I threw out 225 just off the top of my head because it kind of felt right, but I was right there in that neighborhood. But yeah, you're right. I mean, and those, those are generational players, or what we would consider generational players. And even Kershaw, who recently retired, also never reached the 300 win mark. But he had the 200s there. But I was kind of looking up some information on Rickey Henderson, and there's so many stories, so many stats, so much about Rickey Henderson, because not only was he amazing on the field, he was sort of the personality to go with that. You consider him the greatest leadoff hitter of all time, just not just stat-wise, but intangibles.
Yes, 100%. And I wish that there would be a return to the Rickey Henderson type leadoff hitter, and it's starting to be that way. We've seen some of the guys that have been leading off the past couple of years starting to move down to the 2 and the 3 hole. You think about what's going on in Philadelphia, that Kyle Schwarber was the leadoff hitter for a while, and now he's batting second, and Harper's now batting third, and I like that because I want those guys to have an opportunity to have somebody who's on. But yeah, Rickey Henderson, what I thought was interesting about that is that he had 796 walks in his career to lead off an inning. And that alone, forget about all the walks that he had, just the 796 that he had to start an inning is more than 45% of the Hall of Fame position players' total walks for their career.
Right.
That's nuts.
He's second to Bonds, right, on the all-time walks. And, the interesting thing is they weren't trying to pitch around him, right? They were trying to get him out. But, you have a player like Bonds or somebody where they're just going to kind of pitch around him and get to the next guy. But you didn't want Rickey to be on base.
No.
You wanted to get him out. And so the thing that I think gets overlooked a lot is that oftentimes, because he was also such a threat with the home run, he's got the all-time leadoff home run record. He has 81 leadoff home runs. So you're throwing him probably not a strike in that first pitch. So he's already starting the game with a 1-0 pitch, which really that's what teams ideally want to get into, right? Or immediately they get that sort of the upper hand and the count there. So it's just amazing to think that he, if the intangibles speak for themselves, but also if you look at the statistics, his WAR, and think of WAR. We have mixed feelings on WAR. I think you and I have talked about that a lot. But he's ranked 14th all time in WAR. Every other hitter ahead of him is sort of those middle of the order hitters. So his WAR is based not on his ability to hit for power, but getting on the bases, getting around, scoring, IQ on the bases, things like that.
Yeah, and the only thing that you could ever knock Rickey on is that he didn't have a plus arm, but he was a plus defender. And so he certainly did that. He ran the bases well. He hit for power. He hit for average. And he created chaos from the moment that he stepped on the field. And go back to leading off an inning. What's Rickey Henderson's most famous walk? Right? It ends with Sean McDonough's call of, "Touch 'em all, Joe. You'll never hit a bigger home run." He led off that inning in Game 6 against the Phillies and Mitch Williams, and he drew a walk when they were down, and then Molitor got a hit. Joe Carter hits the home run. Blue Jays are World Series champions, but it all began with Rickey Henderson leading off an inning with a walk.
Yeah, it's amazing to think of how impactful he was on the field, and just like you said, he created chaos. He's got so many stolen bases that, I'm a big fan of the stolen base. I know you are a big fan of the stolen base, and it's nice to see a little bit of a comeback. MLB had to sort of nudge the rules a bit and change the bases and so forth. But it is nice to see sort of speed making a comeback. But his stolen bases are all time 1,406 stolen bases. The next highest guy is Lou Brock, which was a pretty significant, stolen base threat himself. He only has 938, so he's still about 500 stolen bases behind Rickey Henderson, which is just crazy to think of, how often and the confidence that he had and the ability to know when to steal. And it's just amazing to see.
Here's one for you. Remember when he was a Red Sox? Rickey Henderson? Remember
Vaguely.
that? Vaguely, very quickly. 2002.
Right.
He was a Red Sox. When he went to the Red Sox, he had 1,362 steals by that point. Okay, the Red Sox started as a franchise in 1901. They had 1,322 stolen bases as a franchise in 101 years. And Rickey Henderson had more than every Red Sox that had ever played, all added together for 101 years.
Speaking of the stolen base, there's so many Rickey Henderson stories, but one of my favorites is when in the 1987 season, and he got injured and he missed time, and Harold Reynolds led the league with 60 stolen bases, and he called up Harold Reynolds and told him, 60 stolen bases, I'd have that by the All-Star break.
Mm-hmm. And then he hung up.
So it's just amazing.
I liked it when he was going through he was in the A's clubhouse. And they had one of the guys that were on the A's was leading a Bible study in the locker room before the game. And Rickey Henderson walked by and he stopped him and he said, "Rickey, are you familiar with John 3:16?" And Rickey said, "I don't know who John is, but Rickey hitting 320."
Yeah. Well, there's although this is my favorite story, just how sort of wild he must have been to be around. And it's the John Olerud story. I'm sure you've heard it. And he joined the Mets, and he met John Olerud, and he said he wore a kind of an unusual helmet, right, John Olerud, and he said, I used to play with a guy in Toronto who did that, and he said, that was me. That was John Olerud. It was just so funny that he's like just so oblivious sometimes, and just so such a character.
Yeah, no, he was fantastic, and I said underappreciated, I think, for his defense, and all of the guys that kind of thought he was a little too much of a hot dog or too much of this or that, when it came to the on-field antics. That was just sort of who Rickey was, and he would be an absolute superstar. Not that he wasn't in his day, but he would be absolutely a huge superstar in the social media TikTok era. That people would go crazy for what Rickey Henderson was and what he did, and I just loved him. He's one of my favorite players.
It's interesting to hear him now. He's definitely gotten older, and he still has sort of that flair about himself. But it's funny because you think about a lot of the hot dogs now, and he was different, right? He had sort of a different type of flair about himself. You have I don't know if it's because he could, walk the walk and talk the talk, but he seemed to have, there's a lot of big personalities in baseball now, but it was just a difference with Rickey Henderson, right?
Yeah, I think it was that he respected the game and he respected his opponent. Yeah. Even though he was going to go out there and try and beat you, it wasn't necessarily a finger pointing or, it was the slow turnaround first base, but it was more about Rickey celebrating Rickey, and part of it, it worked because he did live in that third person world, and there was almost a separation between Rickey Henderson and Rickey Henderson, and he had that with umpires. And he started complaining from the very first pitch, And he'd always say, well, Ricky don't think that's a strike. But lucky for you, Ricky's good enough that Ricky can overcome your mistake.
Right.
So and he would never look at the umpire.
Right.
He would just talk. And you just sort of, he did it so much, and it was kind of endearing that it just became a comedy routine, and people stopped being mad. I think umpires stopped being mad, and they just thought it was hilarious that Ricky carried on that way.
Yeah, I think kind of how you described it makes a lot of sense. He didn't stick his finger in your eye. He didn't try to, show you up, even though he clearly thought very highly of himself. He thought he was better than everyone on the field, and he was probably better than everyone on the field. But he didn't have that sort of external ego. That it was all about himself and sort of how good he was at the game and how much fun he had at the game, and it wasn't trying to denigrate anybody as in the process. So great. I don't know. Any before we move on, any Ricky Henderson stories? I know you always have a great story to share about.
Well, no, I told you my favorite one was like I said, him in the locker room with the Bible study saying that he didn't know who John was, and who hitting 316 was no big deal because Ricky hitting 320. But I always used to say to first baseman, second baseman all the time when it was time to steal, because he read pitchers better than anybody.
Oh, yeah.
That in the history of the game, that it was always said that he reads pitchers the way that Tony Gwynn reads the spin of a baseball. And he would always say to the first baseman when he was stealing, he would say, "Sorry, Ricky got to go." And he was off.
One story I love, it was off the field, but when he was at Oakland and they were accounting for all their payroll, and at the end of the year they were off by $1 million, and they went and looked, and his bonus check he hadn't cashed, and they found out that Ricky had that check framed. He never took it to the bank, and he said he promised himself when he became a millionaire he was going to frame his first $1 million check. So I always thought that was just funny. One of those funny, quirky stories. I wish I had enough money to frame $1 million check and put it in the bank.
Yeah, but what all his teammates will say, he was extremely generous. Took care of all the new guys, and he always whenever he went to a new team would purchase his number. Famous for giving $24,000 to whoever had number 24 when he got there, and just a great all-around guy. It's unbelievable that somebody in that good a shape passed away at age 65. I wish he was still with us because he was fantastic.
Okay, I want to move on and talk a little bit about NHL.
Before you do on NHL, get to our post, I just want to give a quick shout out to Anze Kopitar of the Los Angeles Kings, who played his final game today. The Kings got swept out of the playoffs by Colorado. Ends up a 20-year season, all of it with the Kings. 452 goals, 864 assists. Two-time Cup winner, two-time Selke Award winner for the best defensive forward, three-time Lady Byng Sportsmanship Award, and the Marc Messier Community Service Award. 2014 Olympian with Slovenia, and they don't always get there, so good for him. And kudos to DeSmith, the head coach, who put him out, even though the game was out of hand. He put him out for the last minute 20 when the whistle stopped so that the crowd could cheer. And LA fans, as you have mentioned, get a bad rap, and I'm one of the people that gives them to them. But the fact that they were down 4 goals and the crowd stayed there to salute and honor him at the end of that game, kudos to the Kings organization and to the fans for giving Anze Kopitar a moment that he deserves. And next stop for him, Toronto and the Hockey Hall of Fame.
Yeah, just a quick note about LA fans, since you brought it up. I think of all fans in LA for any team that are the most knowledgeable and most committed to their teams and probably have the highest sports IQ, I think it's probably Kings fans. Hockey fans in LA probably are pretty solid, you know. And it takes a lot for me to admit that, being a huge Dodger fan, but I think that's probably true. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to talk about a couple posts we made, and this is about 2 different NHL guys. So on April 22nd in 1988, Patrick Sundstrom set an NHL record with 8 points in a playoff game. He had 3 goals and 5 assists. And then more recently, on April 21st in 2022, Casey DeSmith set a Penguins franchise record for saves in a shutout at 52. So it was the Pittsburgh franchise record. And those are not really, we just talked about Ricky Henderson, that pretty much any baseball fan would know, but these aren't exactly two NHL players that jump off the page and you're going to immediately think about, right?
Yeah, it's proof that sometimes just being a guy, you can still have yourself a day. And Patrick Sundstrom was a pretty key guy in those New Jersey teams of that time. But he wasn't the marquee player, and he wasn't who you were going to find on the program bill or on the posters outside the arena. This was a team of Kurt Mueller and Pat Verbeek and Ken Danico. And another guy that was on that team, Mark Johnson, was from Team USA, the team that beat the Soviets. And he's now the head coach, I think, at University of Wisconsin women's program. But Mark Johnson was a big offensive player on that team. And then you had a guy like Patrick Sundstrom who just sort of made everything go. And he was one of those, sort of glue guys. And what a day he had. And it took Mario Lemieux to catch him and tie him for a record that he broke that Wayne Gretzky had. So pretty good day for Patrick Sundstrom.
Yeah, he's never been an all-star in his career. He played for 10 years. He played 5 years in Vancouver, 5 years in New Jersey. And he did have a 7-point game in the regular season in 1984, but after that, never had a 5 or 6-point game. He had some 4-point games. So a pretty obscure player to sort of have that record. And the only other player to ever have an 8-point game in the playoffs is Lemieux, and that's so. And everyone, if you're a casual hockey fan, Mario Lemieux. But this shows you how rare that feat is because that's it. It's just those two names on that list.
And let's talk real quick about that Devils team because they had made the playoffs for the first time since coming from Colorado. And remember, the Devils were originally the Kansas City Scouts. They played for 2 years there. They went to Denver, were the Colorado Rockies, and then they came to New Jersey and were the Devils. They never made the playoffs in Kansas City. They made the first round of the playoffs and got swept one time when they were the Rockies, and they had never been to the playoffs since they came to the Devils. And they needed to win their last game of the season against Chicago in order to make the playoffs for the first time. And they got a goal to beat the Blackhawks with an assist from Patrick Sundstrom. And he set up the play that created the goal that sent them to the playoffs. And that was really a start of a New Jersey renaissance where they made the playoffs in 20 of the next 23 seasons. And you sort of think, well, I wonder what would have happened if they lose to Chicago and they don't make the playoffs again. What happens in New Jersey? Do they still capture the fan base? Do they decide to switch up the team? Do they blow this whole thing up? What happens? And Patrick Sundstrom, here's a guy not just doing in the playoffs, but he made the big pass to get them to the playoffs. And I wonder what would happen in New Jersey without him.
Yeah, he's Sundstrom, and there's a lot of players who are like that where, you need those players on your team, right? You need those role players. You need those guys who are able to sort of facilitate and help the star players get in position, or they have the ability to fill a critical role on a certain play. And sometimes they find lightning in a bottle like Sundstrom had in that playoff game. But he had a 10-year career, so, obviously he brought something to the table. He wasn't anyone who wasn't ever gonna, without an all-star appearance, he isn't someone who's necessarily gonna dominate for any stretch of time. But you need those guys right on your team to build your roster around in a team sport, especially like hockey. Maybe less than basketball because it's a lot smaller in terms of starting players. But hockey, football, baseball, those teams require a lot of players on the ice, on the field.
Yeah, they do. And you think about the other guy you had talked about, Casey DeSmith. Talk about have yourself a day. Here's a guy who's been a backup his entire career. This guy's never been a starting goaltender. I think the most he's ever played is 38 games in a season. He's a backup this year. He's backing up Jake Ottinger in Dallas. And when you go through the list of all of the great Penguins goaltenders, you're not talking about Casey DeSmith. You're talking about Marc-Andre Fleury, and you're talking about Tom Barrasso, and you're talking about Matt Murray. You're not even talking about Casey DeSmith. But 52 saves in a day, I started to remember other guys that you would not expect to do stuff like that. And we just had one with Bam Adebayo scoring 83 points.
Oh, yeah.
Who has Bam Adebayo, a guy that had 16 career points per game, hits 83. Remember when Scooter Gennett hit 4 home runs in a game?
That's right.
Scooter Gennett, 4 home runs. You expect that maybe out of Mark Whitten, who did it. Still a surprise, but at least it's Mark Whitten. Mm-hmm. But Scooter Gennett, 4 home runs, that's Casey DeSmith like territory.
I was at a game when Trace Thompson, Klay Thompson's brother, but he plays baseball. He was playing. He was with the. It was early in the season. I think 2 or 3 years ago. 3 home runs in the game. It's like, who expects Trace Thompson to have a game like that? But sticking to hockey, I actually pulled up a couple unusual feats by players that are sort of in the dustbin of NHL history. Have you heard this one? Bill Mosienko had a hat trick 21 seconds into the game in 1952. 3 goals, 21 seconds in. And he was never... He probably had a little more esteemed resume than Patrick Sundstrom. He was a 2-time All-Star, and he was a Bing Trophy winner. So he at least had a little bit there, but not exactly a player you would think had a hat trick so quickly in a game. And then I had another one. Brian Boucher has a 332-minute streak of not allowing a goal, and that's a modern hockey record. So 332 minutes.
That's pretty good for Brian Boucher.
Yeah.
And then Bobby Boucher showed up at halftime at a Bourbon Bowl, and the Mudcats win. That must have been his brother.
Well, going back to Casey DeSmith, clearly there's other goalies who've had more saves in a game, right? Dominic Hasek has 70. That's the record. And there's probably a dozen players who've had more than DeSmith. But just shows you, again, it goes back to what we were saying about Sundstrom. They're all professionals. They're all able to be on the ice at that level. And sometimes you just get lightning in a bottle. Everything's clicking for you. Right? Mm-hmm.
And you're gonna have to rely on your backup goaltender for 20 games a year. And all you can ask of your backup goaltender is that they keep you in the game and they give you a chance to win. And all good teams that make it far in the playoffs all have a backup goaltender that came in and was serviceable for between 20 and 30 games a year. And that's what Casey DeSmith was this day, and that's all you can ask for him. And he went above and beyond and had himself a really spectacular day and a good memory. On a Penguins team that wasn't really all that good. This is post Penguins being good. This is when they were in their lull between beating Nashville in the Stanley Cup Finals and just finally returning to the playoffs this year, even though they looked to be in a bit of difficulty against Philadelphia. But they were in a lull at this time, and he was backing up Tristan Jarry, who's not even there anymore. Tristan Jarry just is the goalie for the Oilers now. So Casey DeSmith's gone, and he's with Dallas, backing up Jake Ottinger. So,
yeah, it's funny, actually, you mentioned the Penguins team and that kind of being in a lull. When I was growing up and sort of following hockey, they were one of those teams that was always kind of good. Right? Like the Red Wings, right? They were always good. And it was so strange to see Pittsburgh struggling because in hockey, teams just remain dominant for such long periods of time. There's a lot of that in the NHL. And So yeah, it was weird seeing the Penguins not really being a dominant team for a period of time.
And the Red Wings, neither. You know, the other team that
Yeah,
you
exactly.
mentioned, the Red Wings and the Penguins have really disappeared when it comes to teams that have been at the forefront of the NHL over the past 5 to 7 years.
So speaking of teams that have kind of disappeared, this is a good segue into our next history post. And while you may not, well, many people may not have heard of Patrick Sundstrom or Casey DeSmith, they probably heard of Troy Aikman, who was drafted on April 23rd, 1989, out of UCLA. Number one overall pick. How often do you have UCLA associated with the number one overall pick in the NHL, or even a top pick? But yeah, he was drafted, and I think everyone knows Troy Aikman, especially from TV now. But he was really integral to that really dominant Dallas Cowboys era. Is he the most important player during that dominant Cowboys era?
Absolutely. That quarterback is one of those positions that, I think you can have a dominant running back and you can have a number one wide receiver, but if you don't have somebody that's gonna pull all the right strings, you better have one heck of a defense. You better be that Buccaneers team that Brad Johnson had that beat a really suspect Raiders team with Rich Gannon in the Super Bowl if you want to win with a guy like Brad Johnson. And that was really the turning point for the Dallas Cowboys, was getting Troy Aikman and then the next season getting Emmitt Smith. And his sort of symbiotic relationship with Jimmy Johnson is what made that whole thing go.
Yeah, and he's someone who I think often in football is more pronounced than any other sport, where he would, especially with the quarterback, where you're really better on the field than your stats show. And I think in such a stats and numbers driven era that we're in, I mean, even that's always been the case with sports, but it's so, between all the social media and everything has to be packaged in a nice numbers ranking or whatever the case is, and he doesn't get a lot of respect because he never really put up those big time numbers. He was rarely a top 10 passing quarterback during his prime, and that's because he opted to win, and he would give up opportunities to pad stats or do what it took to to boost his numbers with someone like Emmitt Smith, right, where there was a run first team, a run first offense. But if you look at his playoff record, he had 11 playoff games. He's 10-1, so he knew what to do to win, and that's the ultimate goal in sports, right? I guess not for everyone. For some athletes, they're all about their numbers, but for him, that winning and bringing in championships, they won 3 Super Bowls. I think he's probably a really good example of someone like that. I think of Joe Flacco as that type of quarterback, although far, far, far less talented. But he's someone who didn't really have the stats, but he knew how to win, and he was someone that you felt good going into big time games with.
Yeah, he had a really accurate arm, and he was the first Cowboys quarterback to have 3 straight seasons of 3,000 yards. Part of that had to do with Norv Turner's offense and the way that football was changing offensively. But I think if you ask Troy Aikman what stat he would be most proud of, it's that he had 90 wins in the decade of the 90s, which was more than any other quarterback. And that's the stat that he would say is the most important. And that's what led to 3 Super Bowls. He's only one of 4 quarterbacks to ever win 3 Super Bowls. And what's a shame for those Cowboys teams is that the Jimmy Johnson era ended and the Barry Switzer era began. And yes, they got a championship with Barry Switzer. I think a lot of people, including myself, think they would have gotten that one with Jimmy Johnson, and they probably would have gotten maybe 2 more if Jimmy Johnson had been there. And the thing that's strange about Troy Aikman is his relationship and how his career intertwined between Barry Switzer and Jimmy Johnson. And when he was a high school senior, he was being recruited heavily by two schools. Remember, he was from Oklahoma. He's from Los Angeles, but then his family moved to Oklahoma. He went to high school there.
That's right.
The two programs that were really after him were Oklahoma, coached by Barry Switzer, and Oklahoma State, coached by Jimmy Johnson. And he was all set and wanted to go to Stillwater and play for Jimmy Johnson. And he had one last visit to go to Barry Switzer in Oklahoma. And Jimmy Johnson said, "Don't go. Don't go. Just come to, just don't go. Come over. Don't go." And he said, "No, I owe it to myself to see what it's all about. I want to go." He went, had a great time. Barry Switzer convinced him that he was a perfect fit for the offense, even though Barry Switzer ran an option offense. And we all know that Troy Aikman's not the fleetest of foot, and he's a drop-back quarterback. But he did run the option in high school, but, that's high school in rural Oklahoma, so the competition level was not great. He decided to go to Oklahoma, and he played really, really well until he broke his leg against Miami, coached by Jimmy Johnson. And he lost his starting job, and then he ended up transferring to UCLA. And he said he kind of wanted to go home, but he wasn't sure about UCLA. And then Barry Switzer, who had his new quarterback in Jameel Holloway, who was a traditional option quarterback, he said he had to convince Terry Donahue to take Troy Aikman. Terry Donahue didn't want him. He was like, I don't know. Can he throw? I don't know if he can really throw. And he's like, no, trust me. He can throw. He can throw. He can throw. And he ended up going to UCLA, even though he got a bunch of calls from Miami and Jimmy Johnson, and he told Jimmy Johnson no again. And then, the rest of the Cowboys, his history, he is going to be the number one pick for the Green Bay Packers. And then the Green Bay Packers win their last game of the season against the Arizona Cardinals and lose the number one pick to the Dallas Cowboys and Tom Landry, who probably didn't want Troy Aikman. But then Jerry Jones buys the team, fires Tom Landry, hires Jimmy Johnson. Jimmy Johnson finally gets his prize with Troy Aikman. And then they end up with Barry Switzer anyway, back. So he had both of those coaches in and out of his life for, his whole pro career.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how many sort of paths cross, and especially in football that happens a lot, but just in sports in general. But that's such even more than you usually are accustomed to is Jimmy Johnson and Barry Switzer in and out of his life so much. And it just shows that how well Jimmy Johnson knew Troy Aikman, the player, and knew what he was getting after all these years.
Yeah, and he really ended up, even though he chose Barry Switzer, and then he was really excited when Barry Switzer came. He told all the guys, "Oh, you're going to love Barry Switzer. I played for him in Oklahoma. He's going to be great." And the whole thing blew up and didn't work because Jimmy Johnson and Barry Switzer are so different in how they are coaches. And with Jimmy Johnson would yell and scream and kick and moan and carry on. And so Jimmy Johnson was bad cop, and then Troy Aikman was good cop. And he would get in the huddle and be like, "All right, guys, just don't forget about Jimmy. Let's run this play. Let's get it going." Well, Barry Switzer was the complete opposite. Barry Switzer was like, "You're all grown men. I don't have to police you." Barry Switzer was like, "You guys aren't really into practice today. You're all hungover from the last night. Let's just call it early today." And that really irritated Troy Aikman. And so now Troy Aikman was bad cop and Barry Switzer was good cop, and the dynamic didn't work at all, which was why the end of Troy Aikman's tenure in Dallas was, a handful of mediocre seasons.
Yeah, but prior to the Troy Aikman era, it had been a long time since the Cowboys were really relevant. It had been over a decade since they really were significant playoff threats. They lost to the Steelers in 1979. The year before that, they beat the Broncos in 1978. But they went all that time as, America's team, but they really hadn't really made much noise. So, start of a new era for the Cowboys, revitalized era.
Yeah, the only time that they were close was when they got beat Joe Montana and Gary Clark in the catch the great call by Vin Scully
That's right.
in San Francisco. But other than that, they were relatively anonymous all throughout the 80s. And then they have been, ever since they beat the Steelers in Super Bowl 30, they really haven't been relevant for the last almost 30 years now. Little shy of 30 years. A handful of playoff appearances and whatnot, but never as serious a contender as those in the media wish they were each and every year.
Yeah, there's a million jokes out there, and I'm sure they're wanting to get back to relevance to sort of not be the butt of all the jokes out there about the Cowboys being a dominant team, because it has been a while. Before we move on, I'm just curious. You always have an interesting perspective on things. What's your opinion on Dak?
I feel like Dak is a better quarterback than he gets credit for, and but he is not as good a quarterback as he should be. And I just feel like he doesn't necessarily understand the one fundamental that Troy Aikman understood, and that is every play is not designed to score a touchdown. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you just need 5 yards. So go get 5 yards. And sometimes you just need to hold on to the ball, take your sack, take your medicine, and play another down. And he's a little reckless and a little careless for my liking. And sometimes he's a little too greedy when he needs not be. Mm-hmm. Just move the chains, Dak. But I would rather have Dak Prescott than anybody else that Dallas has trotted out since Troy Aikman.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I'd rather have him than Tony Romo. I'd rather have him than the slew of backups that they've had, or the people that have been available in free agency. But
yeah.
Did you know, what's one quick thing before you move on about Troy Aikman? Did you know that when he was a senior in high school, he won the state typing championships?
I didn't know that.
He said he took typing to meet girls in high school, and he was good at it, so he took typing too, and he ended up being sent as his school's representative to the Oklahoma State High School Typing Championships, and he won.
Where Jimmy Johnson was at the... No, just kidding.
Right.
That's interesting. Do they even have typing class in schools anymore?
I don't know. They had it when I was in school, but typing was a thing. I started college with a typewriter and ended with a laptop.
Yeah, same.
So.
Yeah, when I was growing up, we had this was going back to like middle and early high school. It was a really big deal. We had a typewriter that could erase. That was really fancy because my parents had an office supply business. And
but we had typing class, and we still had wood shop, and we still had home ec, and we still had calligraphy and music class.
Would typing class in 2026 be?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
I think everybody's got a laptop in there. They take notes with a laptop, not with the paper and pen. So maybe.
Yeah. All right, I want to talk about a really important historical figure that probably not a lot of people know about. And on April 20th, going back to 1936, Ellison Brown, who went by the nickname of Tarzan, and who was a member of the Narragansett tribe. I knew I was going to mess that. Narragansett tribe. He won the 40th Boston Marathon. He had a time of 2 hours, 33 minutes, 40 seconds, and it qualified him for the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And this is when it gets really impressive. Although he didn't finish the Olympics, he got a lot of criticism over that. So to prove everyone wrong, he went and he raced in the Port Chester, New York Marathon. And then the very next day, he won that marathon. The very next day, he went out and he raced in the Manchester, New Hampshire Marathon and also won that. So he won back-to-back days of winning a marathon, and something even by modern athletic standards is just mind-boggling that someone could do something like that. And I know you're a huge marathon fan. You follow marathon a lot. Let's set the table here. how impressive is winning 2 marathons on 2 consecutive days?
It's unheard of. No one, the guys that are running the marathon now, the day after the marathon, are probably going for a 2-mile walk and a 1.5-mile jog. Probably. That's going to be it. He ran Port Chester in 2 hours, 36 minutes, and 56 seconds. And then goes to Manchester and runs that one in 2:45:52. And if you were to drive there now, and this is going on speed limits the way they are now, which is significantly higher than they were there. And when I put it into the map, it's a little over a 4-hour drive from Port Chester to Manchester. And if you have to take the train, it's 8 hours.
Yeah.
And so he had to get there, and I'm guessing it probably was on the train. I don't know. There's no record of how he got there. But whether it's 4 hours or 8 hours or somewhere in between, after running a marathon and all that beating on your legs when you should be doing ice and recovery and all of those things just so you can walk the next day. And he's also not in elite level running shoes. The guy's... Yeah. He finished one of his marathons. His shoes were bothering him, and he finished the last 10K barefoot on the street. So forget about the equipment issue. That is some kind of feat. But he was just a really neat guy and a seminal participant in the Boston Marathon. And when he won in 1936, that's a super famous race in Boston Marathon history because he had come up behind Johnny Kelly, who was the defending champion who'd won in 1935. And they were friends. They used to train together. They were buddies. They hung out all the time. And Johnny Kelly came up behind Tarzan Brown. He patted him on the back and said, I kind of like, good job, I'll take it from here, and started to surge ahead. Well, Ellison Brown followed him and then went up and beat him. And he beat him right there at the Four Hills, which is now known as Heartbreak Hill.
That's right. Yeah.
And it was because Jerry Nason of the Boston Globe had written that story and said that he had broken Johnny Kelly's heart on the hills. And so that's been Heartbreak Hill ever since because of Ellison Tarzan Brown and his ability to pass defending champion Johnny Kelly in the closing stages of that race.
It's interesting. I've been there to Boston, and I remember Heartbreak Hill, and I always wondered why it was called that. I never knew. The thing that I thought was interesting about his back-to-back marathon wins right after the Olympics is that the media during that time framed it as a racial thing, right? That because he was Native American, he was an inferior physical specimen or whatever language they would use.
It wasn't physically inferior. It was that he had no heart, and it was lazy, and he had no heart.
Right.
And that's what really bothered him. That they questioned his toughness.
Right. Yeah. So to set a statement, to make a statement, he went out and he said, proved everyone wrong, and boy did he prove everyone wrong. And the other thing it gets overlooked, but because the Olympics was canceled in 1940, he also qualified for the Olympics. It was canceled for World War II, but he qualified for the Olympics in 1940 as well. And he won the Boston Marathon in 1939, right? So he's a two-time Boston Marathon winner. And he won the Boston Marathon in the driving wind and rain and the cold. And, it's amazing to think of the adverse conditions a lot of the runners went through, in some of these marathons of yesteryear and these races of decades old. And just makes it more impressive that they were able to accomplish these feats.
What's crazy about that 39 win is he had run the marathon in 1938, and he finished 53rd out of 60 in 1938, and he ran it in 3:38:39. He comes back the next year and wins it in 2:28:51. More than 70 minutes, an hour and 10 minutes faster a year later.
Yeah. Wow.
And, you think about them and what their training was during that time. These are all Great Depression marathoners. Mm-hmm. So there's no nutrition for them. They're not eating the way that they should. They don't have money for equipment. They had time to train because they didn't have jobs, but they still used what energy they had to do this and to do it on the sort of malnutrition that they had at the time. It just incredible group, a real interesting time in American and world marathon, really from about 1932 up until World War II, and then probably in the next 6 to 8 years after World War II. There's some of the greatest names of all time have competed in that era.
Yeah, so really interesting story. Definitely someone, if people are more interested in this history and some of the not a lot of great Native American athletic stories, and this is such an interesting figure in marathon. So I highly recommend, if someone's interested, check out a little more about Tarzan Brown. I want to move on to UFC. Mm-hmm. We haven't talked about UFC, so we're going to go from a sport that's very old in marathon to a sport it's fairly new, at least for the mainstream. UFC's existed in a variety of different forms over the years, but one of the more recent sports. And on April 25th in 2003, during UFC 42, Matt Hughes defended his title for the fourth time against undefeated challenger Sean Shirk. Do you remember this match? It was a pretty big moment in UFC history. The sport really exploded.
It was, and Matt Hughes was one of the early stars of MMA, as it was just trying to figure out exactly what it was. And I don't know if you saw the very first UFC 1, but it was nuts. It was nothing like we have seen recently. It was almost like a video game. There was a guy that fought with one boxing glove, and there was no weight classes, and there wasn't really a time limit. You either knocked the other guy cold or they tapped out, and you had multiple fights in one night. It was a tournament, and guys were moving. It was crazy. It was nuts. And so by the time you got to UFC 42, it had sort of calmed down and had sort of figured out what it was and what the strategy was and what this whole thing is. And then they were looking for stars, and along came Matt Hughes, who was one of the biggest names at the time and really helped to drive particularly that welterweight division, which we think about boxing and the heavyweight division being the be-all, end-all. But really in UFC, it's that welterweight division is the one that everybody wants. That's the crown. That's the belt that everybody wants.
Yeah, he was really someone who drove fans who hadn't really followed UFC to turn on the TV to watch it. He was a very marketable personality, and his style being very scrappy and someone who just kind of clawed his way through matches, and someone who, I think the drama of you think you've had him beat. And he has a lot of matches where he was able to really sort of free himself and really turn the tables on whoever he was facing. There's a Frank Trigg at UFC 52. Hughes escaped literally carrying Trigg across the cage and slammed him and then choked him out. And that's cited by Dana White as one of the greatest UFC fights of all time. For Dana White. And so I think the fact that you couldn't really put him down easily, and it really gave fans someone to cheer for, and sort of that underdog, scrappy, blue collar sort of personality that they were able to really market the sport through.
One of the things that he did is they were trying to figure out who's going to be an MMA fighter. It's the mixed martial arts, but what martial arts are they coming from? And the earliest, most successful people were the Gracie family, jiu-jitsu, Royce Gracie and Renzo, and people that had come through their school. And Matt Hughes was a wrestler. He was a really good high school wrestler, college wrestler. He went 131-2 in his high school career, and he sort of revolutionized the wrestler transitioning into the MMA fighter, because there's not a lot of kids going around learning jiu-jitsu in the United States, right? They're wrestling. And he's showing how you can use those wrestling moves to translate into an adaptation with some jiu-jitsu and some judo and boxing in order to create this sort of new MMA style. And that was really where he sort of left his mark on it. And he became known as the Gracie Killer, because he beat Hoist Gracie, and he beat Renzo Gracie, and he beat Matt Serra. All the guys from that, Gracie family, he ended up beating those guys, and really turned into, one of the more important figures in the creation of MMA as we know it, and had some of those big fights. They said the three fights, the trilogy with BJ Penn and the trilogy with George St. Pierre, he came out, 1 and 2 against each of them, but those were big key moments. And I think his legacy's taken a bit of a hit as the years have gone on. He was in an accident after he had retired in 2017. He was in a car that was hit by a train, and he suffered a traumatic brain injury, and they said that he was never going to walk again. He was probably never going to speak again, that he was going to live his rest of his life in a hospital bed. And not only did he learn to speak and he learned to walk again, he got out of that bed and he sort of resumed his life. And there are a lot of remnants of his traumatic brain injury, but he ran into some legal issues, some domestic violence charges that were never brought. They were never brought to court. He was never arrested. There were never any criminal complaints filed. It was just a restraining order by his wife and by his brother. He maintains that they were trying to figure out a way to get him out of their life because he was a burden. The court obviously didn't feel that there was anything to prosecute him over, but he took a huge hit in his legacy from a number of fans and media outlets that said, he's crazy and he's violent and he's a terrible human being because of this happened. And so that really has sort of tainted what would be somebody that would probably be celebrated in much greater tones had all of that not occurred.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but he was at the period that he was in his prime through about 2005. All of the he fought a lot of the former sort of greats and all the up and coming greats, and it all kind of ran through him. So Hughes was really the guy to beat, and so it's unfortunate that his legacy has kind of taken a turn, because I think a lot of people do consider him during those early days of UFC where the sport was growing as the GOAT, or in the GOAT argument. Sad story in terms of sort of later in his life, but it's a little bit of an inspiration for him being able to rebound from that accident.
Yeah, certainly at the time when he was on top, there was nobody as dangerous as he was in the ring, in the octagon. The octagon.
The octagon. Okay, so the last segment I want to talk about is someone who's not dangerous at all. Probably as bad as opposite of dangerous as you can get in a sport, and that is the 2011-2012 Charlotte Bobcats, who finished with a record of 7 wins and 59 losses, which is a winning percentage of 106. Definitely NBA worse. They finished with the season with a losing streak of 23 games. They're up there not just with the worst NBA teams of all time, but probably the worst team sports of all time, at least for the major sports. I'll have a question for you about this, but I want to see what you remember about that team.
Well, they lost by an average of 13.7 points per game, which is not good. They were the worst scoring offense at 95 points per 100 possessions. They were the worst defense, giving up 110 points per 100 possessions. And they were the only team in the NBA that year that shot under 30% from three-point line. So that's bad. To be fair, it was the strike year, and the season didn't start until Christmas, and they didn't have a real full training camp. And you think, oh my gosh, they only had 7 wins, but they only played 66 games. They didn't play the normal 82. So it's not quite as bad as it would first be at first glance without understanding all of the particulars of that particular season. But what doesn't change, Jeff, is that they had 7 wins for the season. And had they been in the NFL that year, they would have needed 10 wins to make the playoffs. The NFL only played 16 games.
Right.
So, that being said, you're 3 games out of a playoff spot in the NFL
Right.
with 66 shots at it. That's bad.
Yeah, you have the 1972-73 Philadelphia 76ers who won 9 games in a 82-game season. So that would seem bad, although they had a tick higher on their winning percentage. So still worse for the Bobcats. I want to ask you a question, because I always think about this with bad teams and my own like personal emotions when I watch sports. When you have a bad team and you know they're bad as a fan, is it more frustrating to watch them sort of lose day in, day out than maybe a team that's pretty good who win more, but they're losing games that you feel like they should be winning? What's more frustrating to you?
Well, given that I've spent the majority of my life watching the Cleveland Browns,
Right.
I know going into the year, Cleveland is going to be terrible. I know that the Browns are going to lose games in a manner in which only one team every 100 years will lose a game, and the Browns will figure out how to do that. And I just know that no matter what the lead is, that the game is never short enough, because they're always going to find just enough time to lose at the end. And when it happens, you go, well, knew that was happening. But when you have a team that is good, which would be my Ohio State Buckeyes, who actually are good. They're one of the only teams that I like that are good. Boy, does it hurt. It is aggravating when they have a game that they should win and they don't. And so I would say it's much harder to take a loss from a good team than it is to watch the Browns lose 12, 13, 14 games a year. Because you just know it's going to happen. At some point, you have to laugh to keep from crying when it comes to a team like the Browns, who once went 1-15 and followed it with 0-16.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. You know, Dodgers are obviously in probably their best stretch in their franchise history, and it gets frustrating when you watch them, like the Cubs game on Friday where they had a 4-0 lead, and then they gave up 6 runs in the final 3 innings and lost that game. It's more frustrating for me to kind of watch that than, let's say, I'm also a Clippers fan, and inevitably you expect the Clippers to sort of, as good as things may seem like they're going in the end, you just kind of expect the Clippers to sort of flatten out and kind of trickle away.
I'm going to read 4 names to you, Jeff.
Okay. All right.
And this is the 4 quarterbacks that started games during the Browns' 2 seasons where they went 1-31. Right? 1-15 followed by 0-16. Cody Kessler, Josh McCown, Robert Griffin III, and Deshaun Kaiser. Those are the 4 quarterbacks that started those games where they went 1-32. How did they ever win one?
You know, it's funny is if you threw those 4 names out and you asked me how many games do I think a team won with those 4 quarterbacks over a stretch of time. I'm going to guess more than one. I don't know
and
how
what's
many I
sad
guessed.
is the one game that was won was RG3.
Yeah.
And he'd be the last one out of that 4 that I would want to start a game. And he's the only one that got it done. They beat the Chargers. They beat the Chargers though. They beat the Chargers. But rough. Yeah, but rough for the old Bobcats. I do not think though that it was the worst season in history. That is the Browns or the Lions, who both went 0-16. It was very close. The Detroit Shock of the WNBA, they lost their first 13 games, but they rebounded, went 9-23, and they had Hall of Famer Swin Cash, so at least they had a Hall of Famer. And the Capitals, remember the old 74-75 Capitals, 8-67-5. So they got one more win, and they had 5 games that they tied. So I'm okay with that. You know what's even funny about remember Angola? Remember Angola from the 92 Olympics?
Yeah.
And Charles Barkley famously said, I don't know nothing about Angola, but Angola in trouble. And then USA went out and beat them 116-48.
Right.
That Angola team won a game at the Olympics. They beat the host nation Spain by 20 points, 83-63. And so they were in one of their pool games. They went 1-4. So not even Angola was as bad, in my book, as this Charlotte team. But the Charlotte team wasn't as bad as the Browns.
The Tampa Bay Bucks are probably the worst NFL team from 1976, that expansion team. I think that was their expansion year.
Yeah, those are expansion year. They were 0-14, so they still lost 2 games less than the Browns.
That's true, but they didn't have anyone on that team that you really would root for. At least you could go as a fan and sort of there's players to root for.
They had Creamsicle. They had the Creamsicle, the Pirate,
That's
the Orange Pirate.
That's a good uniform.
They had Leroy Selman.
Yeah.
He's in the Hall of Fame.
Let's see.
The Browns had Joe Thomas on this team, so these teams. So he's going to be in the Hall. He's in the Hall. So.
All right, Clayton. Well, let's wrap it up there. I want to thank you as always for joining me. I want to let everyone know there's more history to follow on our Facebook, on our Substack. We post every day. You can read up and then catch our podcast here every week. Follow us at Sports and Leisure on Facebook, Substack, YouTube. Subscribe and share. We love talking sports history. If you comment on the posts, we're going to respond back and share your thoughts. Tell us what you remember about some of these games and players from the past.
Yeah,
all right,
please hit like and subscribe. It does help.
It does, absolutely. All right, Clayton, we'll talk to you next week.
All righty, man.
All right.